Good afternoon.
I thought it was hello.
Thank you for being here for our forum. Now I walk on death row, and it's actually our talk with Brother Dale Recinella, and I'd like to welcome him and his wife, Dr. Susan Recinella, to Sarasota. This has been a whole year of forums, starting with Brownsville Song, that have been going all year, and we're so grateful to both the Jewish Federation for helping sponsor it, as well as Ina Schnell and Larry Eager, our public defender, as being a key sponsor on reaching out into the community with these forums. By a show of hands, let me know if you have seen the exonerated. Thank you. Hands down. Has anybody not seen it? Oh, great. About 40% of the audience, 30%. You can still see it this weekend as well. And while you're here, I would like to thank the actors who've put such incredible energy and talent. Would you stand? Stand. It has been my honor and privilege to work with such talent, dedication, and heart. And we close this weekend, and it's going to be an extraordinary weekend. I'd finally like to thank METV, who's been a partner, Charles Clapsettle, Tom, who's here today, who's been a partner in these forums and making sure they are also available to anybody who would like to get online on their website and see what has happened here. So I'd like to thank you very much for that. I'm going to let a person very close to the theater and who I consider a personal friend, a partner in crime, if I can use that word, introduce Brother Recinella. Larry Eager, the very first exonerated, was 12 or 13 years ago. And we were a much smaller theater then. And we wanted to reach out to the community. We didn't know how to do it at that point. We didn't really have the trust and the relationships. We opened the door and contacted Larry Eager, who's our public defender. He came open-armed, open. All the puns in this, it's fun. He came ready to really support, help. He led the talkbacks. He got completely engaged. And if you've been at one of the talks with him, he's provocative, exciting, challenging, and challenges all of your views. We couldn't do this without our criminal justice system because they've been a partner as well. Legal Aid Society is here. Chief Judge Williams is on our steering committee, and the mayor of Sarasota is on our steering committee as well as Michelle Redwine and Trevor Harvey with the NAACP. All of these people say this theater is a forum for thought, and not only for people, but for organizations, so that organizations like Larry's, like our criminal justice system, can reach out and come to the theater and have a public forum where we can have a dialogue that's outside of the box and outside of our respective careers or colleagues or offices. And you have been a champion and a friend and a colleague. I could not be more happy to introduce my friend and colleague, Larry Eager.
I always get a little nervous in these kind of settings. I'm used to smaller audiences. Before I start, I'm not really good at introductions because I'd rather let the speaker introduce themselves and because their presentation is what we're here for. But I do want to point out, none of you paid to be here. So I want you to know that Brother Dale, and the reason I refer to him frequently as Brother Dale is I didn't want to butcher his name, which I'm prone to do as well. So Brother Dale All his ministry is done completely out of pocket. He gets no funding whatsoever. So after you hear him, I hope you consider the work that he does and continues to do and will donate to his ministry so that he can continue the work that he's doing. I want everyone to know that I've invited Brother Dale here because my work with the Public Defenders Association, we brought him in to speak, and there's no greater cynical group of individuals than a bunch of public defenders. And so when Dale came to speak to us, the emotion that was emanated and resulting from it, I can speak only for myself, but I broke down completely from his presentation. We try as attorneys to convey to you what goes on with our clients, to give our clients lives, to give meaning, and so that somehow we can influence that jury's mindset and decision. And in a death penalty case, the ultimate decision of whether or not this person is to be executed or not. I want to first send out kudos to the cast here, because the theater is, and why I've so enjoyed working with the theater, is actors are so much better at it than I am, and they can create and convey my message so better than I possibly could. So I really am just sort of glomming onto them, saying, please, be my conduit. But Dale, who is not an actor, came before us, and moving isn't the word. So I really appreciate all of you taking time out of your day to listen to this and to hear what he has to say, and judge for yourself. With that, Brother Dale.
Good evening. Good evening. Thank you, Mr. Eager. And thank you, Ms. Kate. And thank all of you for being here tonight to help Susan and I share with you our very first visit to Florida Studio Theater. We have been to Sarasota before, usually speaking at churches, but this is our first time coming to this forum. And it has been remarkable, and we feel very warmly welcomed, and everyone has looked after us very well. And so it's an honor and a pleasure to be here. And I'm going to check the time because I'm first generation Italian and a lawyer, and I could go till Monday with barely a breath. But I promise not to do that to you. Also, I want to thank Miss Georgia Court. I don't know if she's in here. The folks at her bookstore have been absolutely marvelous. We met some of them last night and met some of them today, and they're taking care of that part of things. And we just feel totally wrapped around and welcomed. And thank you, the cast, for putting on The Exonerated. We were speaking with a few of you earlier, and I got to try not to break up because for me and for Susan, it's not just a play. It's some of the people we know and people we have met, and it's their stories. And exoneration is a real issue, and we're going to touch on that because as horrible as it is for someone who didn't have anything to do with the crime to be sent to death row and then to be set free, for a person who had nothing to do with the crime to be sent to death row and to get executed is beyond comprehension. And so some of the things we're going to share with you tonight may not be easy to hear. But the reason that Susan and I share our stories is because we realized very few people get to go to the places we go, or to get to meet the people we meet, or to see the things we see. And that means part of the privilege of becoming a part of these people's lives is the duty to bring you with us so that they have an audience larger than just us. And that's why we speak. We share what we have seen and what we have heard and what never sees the light of day, so that you will have been there as we have been, and you will know better what's true. We never imagined we would be doing this. As I said, I'm first generation Italian, my parents from central Italy, born and bred for success the American way. All good. First career was in Wall Street finance, handling big projects, stadiums, seaports, airports, that kind of stuff. And it was good. Those are good things. Having stadiums to watch your football team win, if they win, it's a good thing. We need to do these things. It builds community. It builds a sense of pride. Seaports, airports, we've got to have those. But we came to a point in our life where we really felt it was time to give back in a different way, in a more direct way, in a more hands-on way. And at that time, we were in Tallahassee, where we've now returned to, but we were in Tallahassee. It was 1988. And we got involved in street ministry to the people living on the streets of the state capitol, smack dab between the governor's mansion and the state legislature. And it was amazing. We were there to feed people. It was a soup kitchen. But the two things that immediately swamped us were the severely mentally ill and veterans. The severely mentally ill and our veterans living on the streets. I could never have imagined I would meet these same populations in large numbers on death row. But you do. And as we got involved in this, 88, 89, 90, AIDS was the crisis of the day. And at that time, if any of you were involved in working with the people afflicted with that, the medications were not really very promising. And so it was a real process of becoming involved in death and dying ministry. And I never imagined this would lead to prison ministry. I was asked to start coming to the men's prison west of Tallahassee in the Panhandle, because out of the 2,000 men there, 40% at least were HIV positive, and they had people going into end stage of AIDS. And they needed somebody to come in and minister to them. And so that was my first experience of prison ministry. And every time we hit one of these things, we thought, well, this must be what we're going to do from now on. And it's never been from now on, because something else was always right around the corner, waiting to use the experience that we were getting doing what we were doing right now. And in 1998, we were asked to come to Northeast Florida and make a long-term commitment to the Catholic Church to handle cell front ministry at death row and long-term solitary confinement. Susan and I and our children, as we did with everything, fully discussed it, chewed on it for weeks, and then voted, and it was unanimous. This is what we've been prepared to do. Now, what we thought we'd been prepared to do and what we found and what I'm going to share with you are two different things. But it was what we were prepared to do, and we moved to Northeast Florida, to a small town 3 miles from the Georgia border and 15 miles from Florida's death row. Florida has the second largest death row in the country. People don't know this. We have 400 people on death row, 395 men, all located at two massive prisons right there by Stark, Florida, which is also where the death house is. We have 5 women on death row, and they're in Ocala. But when their warrant is signed for the date set for their execution, they are brought to Stark, because that's where it's done. And so I remember very well when Eileen Wernos, who had been at the women's facility, was brought to Stark for her execution. It's important for you to understand that even before we got involved in prison ministry or death row ministry, we were already making ourselves available to minister to families of murder victims. And so we have no illusions about whether or not the crimes are really horrible. They are. And if there's anybody here tonight who has had a loved one murdered or killed without intentional murder, but killed in a crime, our heart goes out to you. We can't imagine walking that walk. But we have met so many people that do. And what they have found, they tell us, is that there was no healing until they were able to find their way to forgiveness. Not to say that it wasn't bad, not to say that it wasn't horrible, not to say that the person shouldn't be kept out of society and put away and not let out to walk free for the rest of their life, perhaps, if they can't live free without hurting people. But they had to find a way to forgive in their heart. Everybody talks about closure, at least politically. Our work with families of murder victims and families of the executed, that's what Susan does. She pastorally ministers to the family of the condemned during the execution and during the week that they come to say goodbye. And all of them tell us the same thing. There is no such thing as closure when your loved one is killed in a homicide. And what we have found is that it's not just an illegal homicide, which we call a crime, it's also a legal homicide, which we call an execution. Because medically, legally, a homicide is the killing of a human being by another human being. And we have found that the mothers, the sisters, the brothers, the kids, the husbands, the parents, their agony and their grief doesn't distinguish between legal homicide and illegal homicide. They're dealing with the killing of their loved one, either in a drive-by shooting or in an antiseptic room in Stark, Florida. These are not things that we knew. These are things that we have only learned through experience. When we came in 1998 to Northeast Florida, we had no idea we would actually become involved in the process of caring for the condemned and their families during the week of an execution. And I certainly never imagined that I would become involved in ministering pastorally, quietly, to staff during the time after an execution. Because if you're a good person with ethics and a strong moral compass, there's no way to go home and feel good about having participated in killing somebody that you've known for 15, 20, 30 years. And so it does have an effect on the best people who, because of their job, working for us, the taxpayers of Florida, have to be involved in a legal homicide. These are the things we knew nothing about. So in 1998, here we are, coming to take over for Cellfront Ministry at Florida State Prison and Union Correctional Institution. Union Correctional Institution sits right next to Florida State Prison, but there's a creek in between. Really, it's only a creek during the spring, because during the summer there's no water in it. It's a ditch. But it's called New River. And so on the east side is Bradford County. On the west side is Union County. The largest town east of the creek is Stark. And so everybody calls Florida State Prison Stark. That's where the death house is. The closest town west of the creek is Rayford. Would you ever drive 121 from I-10 south to Gainesville, you'll know when you're passing Rayford because there's a flashing light and a stop and go. That's Rayford. In 1992, Florida opened the new death row building at Union Correctional, Rayford. Capacity for 330. As I'm told, and I've had it repeated to me many times, it would meet Florida's needs for death row till Jesus returns. And sure enough, barely any time after it was built, it wasn't big enough. And so the prison that has the death house, Stark, Florida State Prison, had to dedicate one of its wings to overflow death row. So between Union Correctional's 330 and the 65 on the overflow death row wing at Florida State Prison and the 5 women in Ocala, we have 400 people on death row. What did I find when I came to death row? Well, when I tell you that I started in August of 1998, you're going to know that I didn't know a thing about death row in Florida. Because if I knew anything about death row in Florida, I would have asked to start in January. The first thing you encounter in Florida's death row and also long-term solitary confinement, where there is no air conditioning and very little air movement, is the heat. The heat is unbelievable. A few years after I started, I was subpoenaed to testify in a lawsuit in federal court by the inmates against the state of Florida about the heat. And I was trying to imagine how I would describe it, and although I didn't say this on the stand, what came to me as the most descriptive was, it was hotter than I imagined hell to be, but with higher humidity. Thermal index is a measurement of how heat impacts the human body, and it takes into account both the raw temperature and the humidity. Thermal index in solitary confinement and Florida's death row is estimated to be somewhere around 125 to 135 Fahrenheit. But nobody knows for sure because we're not allowed to measure it. In Louisiana and Texas, they have a lawsuit in federal court about the heat for their death row and solitary confinement. They have measured it. They've measured it at 180 Fahrenheit in Texas and 155 Fahrenheit in Louisiana. And you know what those two states are using as their defense? In court. We're just doing what Florida does. And the court didn't make them change it. We've got 5 children, 9 grandchildren. We're blessed. But I can tell you that even my grandchildren, by the time they're 2 years old, know that it is no excuse to say, well, I only did it because so-and-so did it. But what else are they going to say? Because we are up against a horrible problem. We are the only Western democracy in the world that still has capital punishment for people that commit what we call ordinary crimes. Some countries still have it if you kill the king or the queen, or if you are involved in treason that endangers the country. But for the kind of crimes we put people on death row for, we are the only Western democracy in the world that still has the death penalty. So we are the only Western democracy in the world that has to struggle with this question. And the question is, what is our standard of care for human beings that we are holding in 6-foot by 9-foot cages until we kill them? What's our standard of care? Nobody knows. And so nobody wants to say, well, we got to do something better. And so we just accept the status quo and let it go. And how long are these people in these cages, in these conditions? 10 years? 15 years? 25 years? 35 years? At Florida's death row, they've started the 40-year and up club. When we speak to students, and we speak to students in high schools and colleges on both sides of the Atlantic, we ask them, if you have a house that has a bathroom with no shower, like off the foyer or off a guest bedroom, go in there, shut the door, put the lid down on the toilet and sit down on the lid, and imagine being in that space for 3 decades. Now turn off the air conditioning and cut out almost all human contact. That is death row. I could not believe that in this day and age, the most technologically advanced, the most medically advanced, the most civilized nation in the world, the one that calls itself the light on the hill. And I believe all that. I'm proud to be an American. I grew up hearing every day about why my ancestors came to America. I could not believe that in this country, we couldn't figure out a better way to respond to violent crime than to do what was being done 4,000 years ago in the Bronze Age. But here we are. Here we are. I figured I would be going cell to cell. I never expected to go to the death house. I'm a layman. I'm a commissioned layman, but I'm a layman. I'm not a priest. I'm not a deacon. I've got a beautiful wife, 5 wonderful children, 9 grandchildren. Clearly, I'm not ordained in the Catholic Church. I'm just a full-time volunteer. And then it happened. Because when you go cell to cell to cell, well, the first thing that happens is it's very boring on death row, and you're the new guy. So let's see what he knows. And you deal with being the source of a lot of amusement and jokes, which is great. You're there to help people lighten their spirits in this incredible situation. If you can get people to laugh, that's 90% of your work. But this one fellow had told everybody on his corridor, because the corridors are like 15 cells long, and they all face in one direction. That's so that the guy in the cell doesn't see any other human beings in their cells. It's part of the deprivation of human contact. It's by design. And he told him, I'm going to get this, Brother Dale. You watch, I'm going to get him. So when I came on his corridor the next time, they all were waiting for me. Good morning, I'm Brother Dale. Good morning, I'm Brother Dale. How are you today? Would you like something to read? Da-da-da-da-da. And this fellow says to me, don't be giving me that stuff, Brother Dale. I'm calling you out. Who pays you to come here and pretend you care about us? And I looked at him and I said, I'm sorry, I don't understand. He said, who pays you to come here and pretend like you care about us? And I don't get paid. He said, you work for the Department of Corrections? Are you a spy? I said, no, I don't get paid. He said, so who sends you here? I said, I'm here for my church. Oh, they pay you? No. I'm a full-time volunteer. And he looked at me and he stepped back and he said, are you trying to tell us? And he said us because the whole wing was listening. And of course, you know, there's microphones in the ceiling in front of every cell. And there's a camera at the end of the hall. So everything that is said at cell front is on audio and video. So the guards in the guard station on the quarterdeck are listening too. And he says, "You're trying to tell us you come here because you want to?" I said, "Yeah." "And you don't get paid to do it?" And I said, "No." And he looked at me and he said, he stepped back away from the front of his cell and he said, "Don't you ever stop at this cell again. You're crazier than we are." And of course he's right. But after a couple of years, he started talking to me when I would come by his cell. He said, "You can stop here now." And when his warrant did get signed, he asked for me to be a spiritual advisor. And I was with him in the death house. And Susan was with his family at the church. Never expected to be a part of that. But what happened was, one of the fellows that I'd been seeing and praying with regularly every month at his cell, his warrant was signed. And I got a call from the warden. "Brother Dale, you know so-and-so, his warrant's been signed. His execution is set for 2 weeks before Christmas. He's asked for you as a spiritual advisor. Are you willing to do it?" I said, "Absolutely." And I jumped in the car, drove to Florida State Prison, and asked to see the senior chaplain to find out what I had agreed to do. Basically what happens is when somebody's warrant is signed, they are immediately pulled off death row and moved to a death row cell in the death house. The death house is the bottom floor of a wing at Florida State Prison where the execution chamber is, where the witness room is, and where there is a string of cells that men are put in when they have a date set for the state to kill them. Usually they have 5 or 6 weeks from the time they're moved there until the date they're scheduled to be killed by the state. And that is for legal reasons, because usually there's last-minute appeals being heard. Sometimes there has to be psychological testing and all the stuff that goes with this. But it also provides an opportunity for them to have somebody who comes to be with them 12 hours a week, one-on-one, at their cell. That's the spiritual advisor. I said, "Okay, I can do that." "Oh, there's one other thing. In Florida, the inmates aren't allowed to have any family or friends in the witness room at their execution. They're only allowed their lawyer and their spiritual advisor. Are you willing to do that?" I said, "Of course." "But what about their family? Where's their family?" In the movies always show what's done in Terre Haute at the federal facility, or in Texas, and I believe in Louisiana, where there is a separate witness room for the family of the condemned. In Florida, there's only one witness room. And so the family of the condemned have to say goodbye at 12 noon, and they have to leave the prison property, and there is a SWAT mobilization team, fully equipped, fully geared, fully staffed, at the entrance to the prison to make sure they don't come back. Because the highest risk of somebody trying something crazy to save their loved one is the day the state's going to kill their loved one. You know, like driving a semi through the fence, or hijacking a helicopter in St. Augustine and making the pilot fly to the yard outside the death house and land. Things like that, which have in fact happened. They haven't happened with people who are in prison for life. They happen when somebody's boy, somebody's daughter, somebody's mom, somebody's dad is going to be killed by the state. That's when those things happen. the expenses and the mobilization necessary for security for these events is unbelievable. And it all would disappear if we just had life without parole as the maximum sentence. Well, I looked at him and I said, so where are the family of the condemned during the execution? And he said, quite frankly, that's not our job. Our job is to make sure they leave by 12 o'clock. Where they go is their business. Well, we found out that where they've been going is to a motel in Stark to watch the TV to see whether or not the execution goes through. And my wife, Susan, said, this is horrible. Nobody's taking care of them. And she went to the Catholic Church, to the bishops, and said, if the church will accept it, she would make it her volunteer service to minister to the families of the condemned during the execution, off-site. And they said, thank you. Please do that. Now, we always assumed, well, this will only come up when I'm the spiritual advisor. But that's not true, because we had a fellow that I'd been seeing for years at cell front, and he was Muslim, and his warrant was signed, and his wife was Christian, and he wrote a note to the warden and said, could you please call Brother Dale's wife and ask her to take care of my wife during my execution? And the warden called Susan, and she said, of course. People we've never heard about. I never heard about the families of the condemned. I don't know if I thought all these guys were Cabbage Patch Kids. You remember Cabbage Patch Kids? Those of us who say yes, we're revealing our age. But they've got families. They've got families who now are the victims of a homicide. They are the family of a victim of a legal homicide. And the circle of agony and suffering continues to go out and grab more and more people. That first execution, I learned a lot. I was in the death house with this man. It's the afternoon. He's going to be killed by the state. We had been with him and his family in the morning, and Susan was with his family at the church now, and I'm with him in the death house. And this big burly sergeant, I mean, this guy put the red in redneck. He comes down to the death house and he says, chap, give me the front, which means step back. I want to talk right in front of the cell. I said, absolutely, sir, and I stepped back. And he steps forward and he says to the man inside, I never knew you out on the street, but I've known you for 17 years in these two prisons. And I know that you're a better human being than I am. They wanted me to work second shift and I refused, because I refused to be in the building when it happens. He said, I know that you're going to go straight from this cell to the lap of Jesus. And I hope that if God is merciful to me, I will see you someday in heaven. And he put his hands through the bars and took the hands of the man inside. And with tears in his eyes, he said, goodbye, good man. Only recently, very recently, are we starting to hear about what these executions do to the best people on our staffs. I was with the man who was the warden at Oregon's execution prison when the last two people in Oregon were executed. Mountain of a man. Played football. Either semi-pro or pro, I didn't ask. I was looking at him like this. And he said, I heard your talk this morning. I was speaking in Oregon. He said, and everything you said about what it does to the staff, it's truer than you know. He said, I still wake up with those two boys in my bedroom at night. Ron McAndrew, the former warden of Florida State Prison, speaks all over Florida about what his responsibility to supervise executions at that prison has done to him. And he talks about waking up from a dead sleep, knowing that it's always going to be the same. Every one of those men is standing at the foot of his bed. What made us think? How did we get sold the bill of goods that we can kill healthy people who are no longer a threat to society? Just kill them for the sake of killing them. And it wouldn't have any negative effect on anybody but them. That's preposterous. How did we get sold that? I used to believe it. I changed my mind on the death penalty long before I came to death row, back in the mid-'80s, as an attorney, because I found out what it really was legally, which was an absolute morass of contradictions and inconsistencies. It was more predictable to get struck by lightning than it was to figure out who would get a death sentence based on their crime. Totally arbitrary. Had more to do with politics and who was running for re-election than it had to do with anything that happened in the crime. Had a lot to do with skin color, had a lot to do with the race of the victim, had a lot to do with the quality of legal representation at the initial trial, had very little to do with culpability. Found that out in the 80s. Changed my mind on the death penalty. Now I'm meeting the people who are directly affected by it, day in and day out. The family of the condemned, the staff, and in many cases the family of the murder victim, who has been told for decades by the state, stick with us, stick with us. Continue insisting on the death penalty, and when you watch him die, you will feel better. You will feel closure. You will be healed. In the witness room, my seat is second from the left in the front row, spiritual advisor seat. The seat next to me is the seat for the lawyer. Usually it's empty because the lawyers are out trying to get a stay. The rest of the front row, if they come, is the family of the murder victim. Just one of many, many experiences. Young woman in her mid-30s has been waiting for this night for 17 years. Her favorite aunt was the victim of the crime. And they do the execution, the curtain closes, and her fists come up. And she says out loud, "Is that it? Is that all there is?" And then she got her composure and was able to walk out to the vans that take us back to the admin building. What happened? It would be extremely inappropriate for me to ask her that question that night, and I would never see her again. But I've asked other family members of murder victims, what happened? And they told me, oh, we know exactly what happened. The moment he was dead, she knew she had been lied to by the state. She knew she'd been sold a bag of goods, because the moment she saw him dead, she knew nothing had changed. She didn't feel better. She didn't feel closure. She didn't feel healed. She had waited for 17 years for the fulfillment of a promise that was a lie from the beginning. A lot of times I ask people in the audience, as you hear these stories, ask yourself, who's the killing for? It's not for the guards. It's not for the family of the condemned. My experience is it's not for the family of the murder victim. Usually, even the ones who say something positive, what they say to the press afterwards is, "Thank God it's finally over. It's been 25 years." Many enlightened prosecutors around the country, even in death penalty states, have started refusing to pursue the death penalty out of concern and compassion for the family of the murder victim. Because if the person that committed this horrible crime against their loved one gets a sentence of life in prison without parole, boom, it's done. There may be one appeal on technical issues, but there's no super due process. State's not trying to take his life. And they go home. And they have to start working on recovering and healing from this horrendous loss. If the state goes for the death penalty and gets a death sentence, that work is delayed. It is put on ice for 1, 2 decades, 3 decades, some cases longer. And so caring prosecutors in many death penalty states have started refusing to seek the death penalty because of the harm it does to the family of the murder victim. Another surprise, the mentally ill, the severely mentally ill on our death rows. Best estimates are that a minimum of 10% of the men and women on America's death rows have been medically diagnosed as severely mentally ill. Now, if you really break the numbers out, this only makes sense. We restarted the death penalty in 1976 in the United States under the new rules. It was like the new death house in Florida was going to take care of everything, and in a short period of time we found out it took care of nothing. Same thing with the new death penalty. It was supposed to be just, perfect, no more arbitrary. Never happened. But we started in 1976 with the new death penalty. We've had 1,456 executions in that time. Over 86% of all those executions have been in the former Confederate states and the slave-holding border states. The racial bias is historic. It's endemic. Nobody's been able to figure out how to get it out. But also, that's the part of the country that is least supportive of mental health services. If you look at per capita spending by a state on mental health services, the basement are the same states that are the highest on the use of the death penalty. We execute the mentally ill, and we do it regularly. It's almost a subtext to the American death penalty. I never knew that. Never knew that. But here they are. Bigger shock. Our veterans. Our veterans. At least 10% of America's death rows are made up of U.S. service veterans from our overseas adventures. This was a secret in broad daylight until Veterans Day 2015, when 3 retired generals. Why is it we can't tell the truth until we retire? 3 retired generals co-authored an op-ed in USA Today, Veterans Day 2015. We need a congressional investigation to find out why our prosecutors in death penalty states keep targeting our veterans for death row. Some people actually ask those questions, not Congress. There's been no congressional investigation. Nobody picked it up. But some people actually ask those questions. The simple answer, you boil it down, is because it's easy to put a veteran on death row. You got a guy who has battle medals for bravery under live fire, rescuing comrades in front of live ammunition fire and mortar rounds, and wounded himself, dragging them to safety, one after another. It's very easy to convince a jury that a person who could be that collected and purposeful in such danger that would make any of us nuts is too dangerous to continue to live in society. And it's done with regularity. I thought maybe it was just Florida. I got a guy who's a third-generation forward observer. I've got a guy who has battle stars and things I never even heard of to wallpaper my living room with his papers from Vietnam. And on and on and on. It's national. If you got the death penalty and you got prosecutors that see getting death sentences as their ticket to advancement and higher political office, they're going to go for the low-hanging fruit. And the low-hanging fruit are veterans with PTSD. In a clemency hearing for one of our veterans in Florida who has severe PTSD, the response of the state was, everybody's got PTSD about something. Nobody had a perfect childhood. Really? Where were you when he was fighting to protect us? Nobody talks about this. We've got to talk about it. This is the real death penalty, not the myth, not the God and apple pie myth that's wheeled out every 2 years when elections come around. This is the real death penalty. This is the one we've got. And it's horrible. It's a disgrace, and it dehumanizes us, and it does tremendous harm to everybody it gets close to. My hardest execution at that time was an Agent Orange veteran who claimed innocence. He claimed innocence. And he was scheduled to be executed, and he had 3 daughters in their 20s. What had happened is their mom had a lot of issues and had split. He was raising them and their brother as a single parent. And when he got arrested for this crime that he was on death row for, they were looked after by other family members, but they kept having him as their father. They visited, they wrote. He gave them advice. He listened to their stories. He talked to them about what was going on in their life. He was fathering them from death row. And his warrant had been signed. He'd never had real lawyers. It was a panhandle situation. Everybody on the prosecution and the defense was all kin. He never really had any real lawyers, and he had been sentenced to death on the recommendation of a jury 7-5. Hopefully in Florida, that at least is gone now. We need unanimous, although the state is appealing that to the Supreme Court to try and get that overturned. It's much easier to get 7-5. I mean, who cares if the guy's innocent? That's not our problem. If he gets executed, it counts on my resume. Well, now he got real lawyers for the first time. And they found out that the star witness, the only witness against him, except her husband and her daughter who were called to testify and said, she don't lie, was a woman who the state's psychiatrist had put secretly on psychotropic drugs to get her through the trial. And when the trial was over and he'd been sentenced to death, the state stopped providing the drugs and she was admitted to a mental hospital. This was their star witness against him. Then his new lawyers found out not only that, But she was the original person that the police thought had committed the crime. But she lived on the right side of the tracks. And he was poor, living in a trailer on the poor side of the tracks. And when the police came to arrest her, she said, I didn't do it, but I can tell you who did. Now, she's the one that had the dead woman's purse. She's the one that had the $2,000 check in her handwriting that she had cashed at the bank. The bank called the police. They knew the woman had been killed. That's why the police had gone to her house to arrest her. She said, no. He did it and made me cash the check. He wasn't with her when she went to the bank. But it's a small town and everybody knows each other, and it's easier to pin it on him than it is to deal with her family. His new lawyers went all over town getting affidavits of people that lived near this lady at the time. They all said, she bragged to everybody that she did it and blamed it on him. Why didn't you say something? Well, nobody thought he'd actually get executed. They went to the mental hospital, got affidavits from all the staff. All the time she was here, she told everybody that she did it and blamed it on him. Why didn't you say something? Nobody thought he would get executed. The local judge is being asked by these new lawyers to have a hearing on all these sworn affidavits and determine whether or not this man should be given a new trial. Local judge says, no, the time for new evidence has passed. Did you know that it's called procedural bar? I counted. My last count was the state is asserting procedural bar against evidence of innocence or mitigation, meaning, yeah, they did it, but it shouldn't be a death case, in over 200 of our 400 cases of people on death row. Procedural bar is a major mechanism of the state to get people executed without looking at all the facts. I never knew that. I was supervising a floor of lawyers in a major Miami law firm. I never heard of procedural bar in capital cases. I didn't know it existed until I researched it in the mid-'80s and realized what a shell game this whole thing is. Local judge said, no, can't look at it. That evidence, that box cannot even be opened. Comes to the Florida Supreme Court. 6-1. Procedural bar, can't look at it. The box stays in the courthouse basement and can't be opened. The only justice that dissented was Harry Lee Anstead, and he said, this is an abomination. How can we go forward with this man's execution without even knowing whether or not he's the one that did the crime? The other justices all did the procedural bar thing. For those of you who are of Christian persuasion, I call it the modern Pontius Pilate washing his hands in the bowl. Not my responsibility. See to it yourselves. The day of the execution, we were so concerned about this man's 3 daughters. Susan got permission from the warden to be at the prison in the morning. Usually, if I'm the spiritual advisor, I'm there for the goodbyes with the family. Susan is with the family in the afternoon off-site. She got permission to be there to help take care of these girls. So they were to be in a room on one side of this huge hall. The place where they would say goodbye to their dad was on the other side of the hall. And they were brought over one at a time for their last 15 minutes with their father. They couldn't let go of him, one at a time. They couldn't let go of him. And I knew it was better for me to unwrap them from their father than for a man or woman in uniform to do it. And so one by one daughter at a time, I waited until their time was done, and the lieutenant signaled me that it was done, it had to be finished. And I would take them and unwrap them from their father. They were too traumatized to walk. I had to carry them, each of them, one at a time, back across the hall to where Susan was waiting to help them. try and get their composure so they could leave. And they all kept saying, why? Why are they going to kill my daddy? Why can't they just leave him in prison? Why are they going to kill my daddy? What's my answer? Oh, and by the way, the state would save $55 million a year minimum if we stopped killing people and just had life in prison? Why? Why are we going to kill their daddy? I had no answer. But that night, when I'm sitting in my chair in the witness room, watching this man who I believed with everything in me was actually innocent, I said, this is murder. I am watching a murder of an innocent man. I didn't think it could get worse than that. And just 6 weeks later, it did. Because I was the spiritual advisor for Angel Diaz, December 14, 2006, Florida's infamous botched lethal injection. Now, they say it's not a botched lethal injection because in the trial that I testified in, the judge held the goal of the execution was to kill him and he's dead, so you can't call it botched. Really? Okay. I'm glad you can sleep with that answer. I can't. I watched this man writhe in agony for half an hour. As soon as I got Tower on my cell phone driving home from Florida State Prison, I called Susan, and she didn't know it was me. She did not know it was me. She said, what happened? I said, I just watched a man be tortured to death. The priest who had done this for the church before me, Father Joe, is probably one of the most spiritual people I've ever met in my life. And he'd been handling death row by himself for 15 years. And he witnessed a botched electrocution where the flames were leaping out of the man's head 3 feet into the air. And his burning flesh, and the ash from his burning flesh was filling the execution chamber. And he died screaming. And Father Joe told me, I can't get that out of my dreams. That was the reason they needed somebody to come in and take his place. Yours truly. So when my nightmares started, I went to Susan. Susan is a doctor of clinical psychology. I keep trying to get free services. She won't have it. She knows the patient has to be invested. But she gives me a family discount. And I said, I shouldn't be having nightmares. Father Joe witnessed a botched electrocution. All I witnessed was a botched lethal injection. And Susan, in the tone of voice she uses when she's being my therapist, said, Dale, you told me the autopsies that the Supreme Court of Florida ordered showed that he had burns from the bone to the skin, 11 inches long in one arm and 13 inches long in the other. Because the chemicals never went into his system, his venous system, they went into the tissue. And finally, as they kept pumping in more chemicals, enough leached to his arterial system to kill him. She said, Dale, what's the difference between burning a person to death from the outside in with electricity and burning a person to death from the inside out with chemicals? And I had to admit, there is no difference. And I had to own my nightmares. The two most pro-death penalty Supreme Court justices on the U.S. Supreme Court for the last many years, Associate Justice Antonin Scalia and Associate Justice Clarence Thomas, told us in their opinions in Kansas v. Marsh that if we have executions, we will execute innocent people because no criminal justice system is error-free. And the only way to stop executing any innocent people is to stop using the death penalty. Of course, they then also went on to say this is not the job of the courts, this is the job for the state legislatures. So don't come asking us to do it. I'm paraphrasing them, but that's what they said. I could give you a corollary. If you have executions, you will have botched executions. Because executions are done by human beings, and human beings make mistakes. And the only way to not have any botched executions is to stop using the death penalty. Who's the killing for? It's not for me. It's not for anybody in those rooms at that execution. And it's not for the family that's sitting with Susan at the church. But the people who get up and start yelling rah rah siskumbah for executions at election time are never there. In the book, Now I Walk on Death Row, which, by the way, we were asked to write. We never would have imagined writing a book about our experiences and how our family got to this ministry. We just didn't think it would be that interesting. And we were asked to write it by a Christian publisher whose market is the Deep South, and they felt it was very important for the people in the Deep South to hear the truth. But my court testimony under oath on what I watched in the execution of Angel Diaz, my sharings of the things I have seen and heard and watched people go through in the death house, on death row, and in solitary confinement are all in, they're in there. That's why we did the book. But the long and the short of it is this. There is absolutely nothing that gives any evidence of any kind whatsoever that executions make us safer. Nothing. There's nothing. My undergraduate degree was in econometrics. I'm a numbers jock. I read the studies and I read the footnotes and I read the formulas and I analyze them. And I can tell you that the studies that claim to show that executions prevent murders assume that they prevent murders and then calculate how many. No one has been able to show any credible evidence that executions make us safer or that they make law enforcement safer. Dr. George Kane, who is a police commissioner in New England and is a professor of criminal justice at Western Connecticut State University, is coming out with a study. Right now it's going through peer review, done by him and a former New York State trooper who was on the Major Crimes Task Force in New York State, showing that there is nothing that indicates that executions make our law enforcement people safer. It's all part of the death penalty myth. We need to shake this myth. We need to stop being part of this, even indirectly, because it's being done by our state. And so I ask you, learn everything you can. Get the facts, not the myth, and talk about it so that you can credibly say to people who are still supporting a myth that doesn't exist, you can say to them what's true. And you can say to our representatives who make the policies, don't do this for me. I can't support this. I can't be a part of it, even indirectly. Don't do this for me. Thank you for being here, and I think we're going to take some questions.
Thank you so much. We have time just for a couple of questions. So let me take them, and I'll repeat the question. Yes, sir.
You said that Florida has the second highest death row population in the U.S. And I think that Florida probably has more churches than any place that I've ever seen or been to, although I don't know the exact fact. And I would like to know how you reconcile these two beliefs going on in the same state.
Did everybody hear that? Okay.
A very, very dear friend of mine who has passed away, Father Jim McSorley, who tutored the Kennedy children, Jesuit, told me that in his vast reading and teaching, he had studied across the centuries, and that it's not possible to get good people to kill other people without first convincing them that God wants it. I call it toxic religion. There's no question that the death penalty belt overlaps with what we call the Bible Belt. And that good people that we know and that are our friends, have grown up hearing their whole life that God demands this. And when they find out that that's not true, it's incredible. It's like a cloud is lifted from them. A dark sheath is taken off of them. And we have spoken at churches of those denominations all over the South, with the pastor's invitation, of course, and explained what's really in God's Word and how what we're doing has nothing to do with that. And they come up to their pastor afterwards, right in front of us, and say, "Is what they said true?" And he says, "Yes, that's why I asked them to come." And then they look at us and they say, "I'm so relieved. I never liked it, but I thought I had to support it for God. If I don't have to support it for God, I don't want any part of it." So I don't reconcile it. I try to go right to it and help the people who've been told their whole life that we have to kill each other for God, to make God happy, to help them see that that is part of the myth and to set them free from it. We have yet to have anybody who resented being set free from that. Everyone has been appreciative. So that is the way I respond to that. And you've identified something that is unique to the United States. People overseas can't imagine that the death penalty here correlates with religious practice. So we have to deal with it ourselves, and that's how we deal with it.
Great. And one more question. Yes.
Do you think that with the numbers of people that are being exonerated from death row, the situation will change? It will wake up people to realize how evil this is?
So the question is?
Are exonerations having an impact on death penalty support? There is no question about it. For example, support for the death penalty in this country peaked right around the late 90s. What you had happening in the second half of the 90s was the U.S. Supreme Court holding that the courts could not look at evidence of innocence after the procedural bar had kicked in, that the only option was for the governor to commute the sentence. Here in Florida, we haven't had a governor commute a death sentence, even to life in prison, since 1983. Nobody wants to take the political heat. You had that happen. You had Carla Faye Tucker from Texas Death Row on TV. And it was clear to everybody that watched it that this woman was a changed person. It was so shaking that Pat Robertson of the 700 Club said at a panel at William and George in Virginia, it may be time to seriously consider a moratorium to the death penalty. Because he didn't think she was innocent, but he knew that we were executing Carla Faye Tucker, who was not the same person that had committed the crime. Now, with all the exonerations, and only 20, I think only 20 of the 158 death row exonerations in this country since 1976 have involved DNA significantly. As we get further along and more cases have DNA available, it's even going to be more increased. These exonerations are having an impact. And so you've seen the country go from over 85% in favor of capital punishment to less than 50%. In fact, the number of people in many states, including death penalty states, that support life without parole as a preferable option to capital punishment is 50% to 54%. The Texas legislature fought for 10 years to prevent life without parole as an option, because they said, if we get life without parole, Texas juries will stop imposing the death penalty. And in 2015, after they got life without parole, there were 2 new death sentences imposed in Texas. And one, the guy was mentally ill and asked for a death sentence. So exonerations are having a drastic impact, but also the option of life without parole, which allows you to correct the mistake while the person is still alive, is also having a tremendous impact.
Before we close, Larry, you on our blog, you wrote the exact amount that it costs a country, and either one of you could answer, for life in prison or the death penalty.
Larry, what would you take that?
From my, it's the research that I'm quoting from is somewhat antiquated. It's probably 1 to 3 years. And I do have John Scottese, who will correct me, who's an attorney from the Public Defender's Office. But the estimates are for the average life sentence is $1.3 million. The average expense to execute someone ranges between $5 to $20 million. And I think that what the clarification has to be made, that people think, well, these endless appeals that go on and on, that's what costs so much. Well, the first question, or my first response is, based upon the number of exonerations, we're not appealing them enough. But secondly, you have to look at it from, it is the actual preparation. In my office, the average attorney carries a caseload, felony attorney carries a caseload of approximately between 100 and 150 cases. Those who are assigned death penalty cases, maybe 2. And not only is it that they have 2 cases, but we have to have an entire staff assembled in representing that individual. We have to have mitigation specialists, we have to have investigators, all of this in just the preparation, because the presumption is if your client is convicted and sentenced to death, you are assumed to have been ineffective in your assistance of counsel. So every single decision that you have made is scrutinized, which is why the mitigation specialist will oftentimes go from birth and track down every single record pertaining to that individual so that we can make that argument if the jury returns a verdict of guilty and there is the recommendation of death, and now it is the jury that makes that recommendation. So it's really, if there are 10 cases that go to trial that the state is seeking the death penalty, that's the level of preparation that we have to do on each case. They may only return a verdict of guilt and a recommendation of death on 1 case, but those other 9, the cost is still there. So that's where the astronomical numbers come into play. So it's not the individual case, you have to look at the state pursuing the death penalty in total. a rather long-winded explanation. So.
Thank you.
Excellent answer.
Before we close, I'd like to let you know that our actors from Exonerated will be out front and will be taking any collections to support your work, you and Susan. So we'd appreciate that. And then second thing, what I'd like to say in closing is there's a line that dreams are private myths and myths are public dreams. And I want to thank you for exposing a public myth that so many of us live under and continue to, and puncturing those holes to bring that down. So it's been our great honor to have both of you, Susan, and we'll be out front there as well for any other questions. But thank you again so much.
Thank you.